Now, I'm not sure what you're Googling at midnight. You might be up late catching up on whatever the streaming show of the week is, or looking up a good recommendation on your Kindle during a rare moment of quiet after kids have toddled off to bed. But while I might not know what's keeping your eyes on your screen, your devices do. And so do the algorithms on the websites you're clicking through as you wave away privacy preference pop-ups standing between you and the article you're trying to load. So what becomes of all those little electronic cookies? And do we care? This is the Codcast, CommonWealth Beacon's podcast about policy and civic life here in Massachusetts. I'm Jennifer Smith, reporter for CommonWealth Beacon. So we are here today to talk about surveillance and data privacy. And to do that, I am joined by Kade Crockford, Director of Technology and Justice Programs at the ACLU of Massachusetts. Kade, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, Kade, before we get started, what is the number one thing you think people are wrong about when it comes to their personal data?
I think probably the number one thing people are wrong about when it comes to their personal data is that there's nothing we can do about the surveillance state and digital advertising and companies like Amazon and Google and Facebook tracking us everywhere we go on the internet and then doing whatever they want with our personal information.
Gotcha. So the idea essentially being that as you kind of navigate your digital life, you're leaving these little footprints behind you. There are things that you are kind of leaving out there in cyberspace that you might not be thinking about, but the advertising folks absolutely are. Is that about right?
Yeah, that's right. Another way of phrasing it is there seems to be, in some circles, this idea that we have to choose between new technology and privacy. And that's a false dichotomy. That's a false choice. We don't have to live in the world that Mark Zuckerberg has created. We have this thing called democracy, and we have another thing called the rule of law. And the people can decide through our elected representatives that we want the technology industry to function differently. So that's what we're trying to do here in Massachusetts.
Gotcha. So as sort of a plate setter here, what are the major categories of personal data that we're talking about here? Where is it coming from? Where is it going?
So many different types of information. So we think about data privacy by putting information into two separate categories. And this is a gross oversimplification, but I think it's useful both for how we think about data privacy issues and, frankly, how we think about regulating them. So there's what we would call and what legislators are calling personal information. That's information that either directly identifies us or could be used to identify us. So it's our name, our address, our email address, our, potentially our login credentials for a website, right? Then there's a separate category of information that we call sensitive data. That is your precise geolocation information from your cell phone. Your biometric data, that is information that is unique physically to you, your face, your iris, your voice, those are all biometrics. Information about young people, information about our health and our searches online related to health and the websites that we visit. So in that category, you could put data that menstrual tracking apps collect, or information about your WebMD visits, or how you communicate with ChatGPT about symptoms that you're having. All of those types of sensitive data are particularly in need of regulation. And so, both of these types of data, ordinary personal data, which can be used to hurt us as well, and then these particularly sensitive types of data, and there are others as well, veteran status, citizenship status, your race, your gender identity, those types of things. They both need to be regulated. This information comes from so many different types of sources, so many different types of companies are collecting these data and manipulating them. And one of the important things that lawmakers are doing now is crafting smart regulations that are not focused on one particular industry, but rather will protect our data no matter what type of company, whether it's your internet service provider or a platform like X or Meta is collecting. They're going to apply rules to all of that information, no matter whether it comes from your cell phone or from a laptop or another digital device that you use, like an Apple Watch or a Fitbit.
So to kind of ask a bit of a meta question, which I realize is a turn of phrase I shouldn't use when we're talking about, in part, the company Meta at this point, is how have you seen conversations about this sort of data evolve over time? Because one of the major ways that it's come up, at least from kind of a reporting structure, is, well, most of the apps or most of the things that you use are saying that they're using the data because they're actively trying to make the product better or make the kind of experience of using a website better. You might want to use a menstrual tracking app, and it's hard to do that if your phone doesn't know literally what you've put into it. So how have you seen kind of the discussion about the utility of this data evolve over time?
That's a great question. I think we have been sold a bill of goods by very wealthy, influential people in Silicon Valley for about 15 years now that essentially says, you like the internet, you like digital devices, well, a totalitarian surveillance state is the only way that you can have those things, right? And initially, they told us that by saying basically, sure, we're collecting extremely detailed information about you and your children and everyone you know, and we're going to hold on to that and use it in all sorts of ways. But you should relax, because the only thing that we're really trying to do is sell you products, right? We just want to deliver you. I mean, you'll hear this all the time from Silicon Valley tech lords. They say things like, we just want to deliver relevant advertisements to consumers. Don't consumers want to see relevant advertisements, things that they're interested in? Anybody who's actually used the internet knows that they're not awfully good at it. You buy a mattress, and then for 6 weeks, you're getting haunted by mattress advertisements all around the internet, no matter where you go. So they're not very good at it, but they are collecting huge amounts of data about us and using it to sell us ads, basically to try to get us to buy stuff, right? That's kind of the fundamental business model of the 21st century internet. What we've learned, though, in the intervening, I'd say, past 5 or 10 years, really since the Cambridge Analytica scandal, so I guess that was 10 years ago almost at this point, is that not only can these huge tech companies sell us shoes or, a nice jumpsuit or whatever, they can also sell us fascism. They can also target us with advertisements that are very specifically tailored to who they think we are, that might make us more likely to vote for Donald Trump or support a policy that is going to hurt us in the end, or, manipulate us in other ways that are dangerous to our individual liberty and to our democracy as a whole. And then the other thing that we've seen is that these data broker industries, like the location data broker industry, for example, which got its start through digital advertising, has now realized that there's this very profitable side business for them, which is selling our precise location data to the government, to ICE. And that is happening right now. Donald Trump's ICE has contracted with a variety of companies that come from the digital advertising space and collect and process huge quantities of our precise geolocation data from our cell phones. And they've got this side hustle going on where they're selling the data to the government, and ICE is using it right now to target and track people all across the United States, both immigrants and most likely the people who are, as the heroes in Minnesota are, risking their lives to document these human rights abuses that are taking place, particularly in Minnesota, but all across the country. So, there are many different harms. And I think that's one of the things that we've learned recently is this is not just about advertising. It's not just about selling us stuff. It's really about controlling us, limiting our choices, limiting what's available to us, and then in some cases even directly controlling us by, giving the government access to this information when, they really should be getting a warrant to access that data.
So to kind of dig into the kind of political angle of this, not that any of this doesn't have a political angle, but how much of this is something that, in your view, is an issue kind of regardless of the party in power, and how much of it is specific to concerns that the ACLU of Massachusetts has at the moment? Because to my knowledge, the idea of tracking and selling and distributing personal data didn't start in 2020, for instance, didn't start in 2016. It's been going beyond that. So can you kind of break down how much of this is a broader question of data privacy, and how much of it, in your view, is kind of party specific?
Yeah, that's a great question. And others are probably familiar with the fact that the ACLU works on a range of issues. I have colleagues that do reproductive justice work, LGBT rights work. Some of that is very controversial, right? Politically in the United States. There are real disagreements left, right, center about what we ought to do with respect to regulating those types of issues. That's not the case when it comes to privacy. Privacy is a fully bipartisan issue. Pluralities of Americans in both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party support legislators passing strong privacy rules to restrict big business and corporations from collecting and manipulating our personal information. It's not even close. So, for example, we did a poll a few years ago when we launched our campaign on these issues with Beacon Research. They asked Massachusetts voters, left, right, and center, independents, Democrats, and Republicans, voters, would you support legislation prohibiting the sale of your precise geolocation data from your cell phone? And we got Stalin numbers. It was 92% of respondents said yes, right? I mean, we had to sort of do a double take, like, really? But it's not surprising. You go out, you talk to your neighbors, you talk to somebody you meet on the bus, and you ask them, do you think it's appropriate for companies to be selling information showing where your children go 24 hours a day? And the answer is universally no. It doesn't matter what your political perspective is. These are views that are shared widely across party affiliation and, political ideology in the United States.
One area where this came up for me, because I'm often kind of a courts reporter here at Commonwealth, is the question of, to what extent kind of the essential tracking data is in line with or kind of in conflict with Massachusetts's wiretap laws, which are some of the strongest in the country. The idea of, you need what's called two-party consent. You need someone to agree to be recorded or monitored, and you need to also agree that you yourself are recording or monitoring them, which can be a little unintuitive for people. So how is data privacy in conversation, in your experience, with this sort of protection that the state offers to not be monitored without your consent?
I love that question. Our wiretap statute is fantastic. And it essentially says you can't secretly audio record someone in the state of Massachusetts, right? There is a similar idea that's at play with this data privacy legislation, which is that take, for example, biometric data, which is among the most sensitive types of information. We have seen reports here in Massachusetts about Wegmans, the grocery store, using facial recognition to track shoppers, for example. That is a violation of privacy that should be unlawful in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Just like you don't want somebody on the bus secretly recording the conversation you're having with your spouse in whispered tones about a disagreement you have over, childcare or something like that, and then blasting it all over the internet. You also don't want your grocery store collecting your biometric data without your knowledge or consent when you go to get some milk or eggs to take home to your family, right? And so it's a very similar issue, actually. And in fact, I was reading a story this morning about young people and their experience with these meta surveillance glasses, which have started to show up in classrooms and school communities across the United States. And there were quotes from some young people who were really chilled by this. They basically said, we feel like we can't have normal conversations in, open spaces in our school community because we're worried that somebody might be secretly recording us. And I think the same type of chilling occurs online where, if you don't know what's happening to your most sensitive information that you're leaving behind in these digital trails, Maybe people aren't going to go to a protest if they worry that, companies are collecting their location data and selling it to the government, for example. Maybe they're not going to engage in First Amendment protected activity that they otherwise would. So there really is a very similar dynamic at play related to the chilling of speech, related to our basic human need for privacy in order to, have human dignity and full expression as human beings. And so I do see this as the 21st century accompaniment to our very strong wiretap law, which was passed again because of advances in technology. The legislature realized, well, you can now tap people's phones, and that's happening. So we better do something about it. Legislators today are realizing, whoa, there's a lot of data out here that companies are collecting and manipulating and selling without people's real knowledge or consent and in ways that are really violative and creepy. We better get a handle on that.
So I think that's kind of a good pivot into the specific policies that we're talking about right now. The Senate has passed its version here in Massachusetts. The state Senate has passed its version of a Data Privacy Act. The House is working on its right now. So let's start with the Senate here. What is kind of the substance of that law that they passed?
So we as advocates have been asking lawmakers essentially to do three things in privacy legislation. The first is what's called data minimization. And that basically says, I'm going to use the milk example again, that just like when you go to the grocery store and you buy a bottle of milk, you do not have to take the milk home and test it to see if there's E. coli in it, because the government has established baseline food safety rules and regulations, and every company that sells milk has to abide by those, right? We think online privacy should work the same way. So that instead of this notice and choice model where, you go online and you see a big pop-up that says, select your privacy choices, and there are 45 different things to choose from, and it's very confusing, and most people just click the first thing so that they can move on and access the content. Instead of that, which really, puts a huge burden on individual users of technology, we think there ought to be basic rules in statute that limit how companies can collect and process our personal information. And so that's what data minimization is. The Senate did a very good job on that. They put strong data minimization rules in place. The second thing that we want to see in this legislation is a total ban on the sale of sensitive data. So that's that category of data we were talking about previously. It's precise geolocation data, biometric information, children's data, information about your religious expression, your healthcare choices and interests, your whether you're a veteran or an active military member, whether you're, the House is considering in their definition of sensitive data, whether you're a union member, we think that ought to apply too. So there are all sorts of, special pieces of information about us that are especially sensitive. The Senate banned the sale of what they defined as sensitive data. So that's a huge victory as well. The third thing that we're looking for in strong privacy legislation is strong enforcement. Because again, the law is really a suggestion if it doesn't have meaningful enforcement mechanisms in place to make sure that companies follow the law. So we are hoping that at the end of this process, lawmakers will have enacted a strong privacy law that gives consumers the right to sue to enforce their own rights in court, a private right of action. That's what we have with the wiretap statute, which is a law that people pay attention to because they don't want to get sued, and people follow the law as a result of that. There are also criminal penalties that attach to the wiretap statute, but at a sort of basic level, if someone secretly records you, you have a right to take them to court and sue them under the wiretap statute. We think that in addition to Attorney General enforcement action, privacy law needs to be enforced as well by individuals who are wronged by companies that violate their rights. And the Senate did part of that. They applied Attorney General only enforcement to their privacy legislation that they passed in September. So we're very excited about working with the House and then, potentially in Congress to see some stronger enforcement.
And one thing that occurs to me kind of in all of this is because you mentioned the sort of model of inform and choice basically, like the idea that, well, if you see the accept or reject or choose your privacy preferences kind of up on a screen, most people, if they're just trying to, look up what time the next bus is coming from, are probably not thinking about what they want to be agreeing to there. But the counter that comes up often is, well, what if people do really want to see something tailored to them, if they don't mind if their data is sold to whomever? I'm sure there are some people like that out there. Is that kind of a priority or a concern at all, the idea that you might want to opt into that?
So I'm not concerned about that. And I haven't seen a real consumer hunger for being tracked and monetized on the internet, just in the same way that I haven't seen a consumer hunger for buying contaminated milk. People people want to be protected, and they don't want companies inappropriately collecting their data and then using it in creepy ways that violate their privacy. I just want to be clear, though, that data minimization does not mean companies can't collect any data. It means they can't collect more data than they need to provide you, the customer, with the service that you've requested. So I'll give you an example. And there are different rules applying to personal data and sensitive data. For personal data, like your name, your email address, things of that nature, the rule that the Senate passed says companies can only collect what is reasonably necessary to provide you with a service that you've requested. But then once they collect it, they can use that data however they want. With sensitive data, the rules are different. That's biometrics, precise geolocation. That says companies can only collect your sensitive data if it is strictly necessary to provide you with the service that you've requested, and they can only process it to give you that service, right? So I'll give you an example of why that matters. You download, say, a menstrual tracking app. And you use that to say when your flow is heavy and when it's not, and it gives you a prediction of when you're going to menstruate. That's super useful, but it doesn't need your location data. There's literally no reason for a menstrual app to have your location data, right? And so the data minimization rule applying to sensitive data would say that company cannot collect your precise geolocation data or your biometric data, for that matter, because it has nothing to do with the service that you've requested from that company. So it's really intuitive. It takes a while to explain. It's not a very sexy concept, but once people hear and understand what data minimization actually means, I think it makes a lot of sense to most consumers.
And so to kind of, I don't know if dive into that is the right way to put it here, but it does seem like, in some ways, privacy legislation like that does a sort of end run around the question of who can sell, say, like location data or sensitive information, because you're necessarily restricting the types of apps or the types of websites that could collect that in the first place. They obviously can't sell or hand off information or data that they do not have. But if you're thinking about something like Google Maps, which of course would need to know where you are to tell you where you're going or trying to go, how does that then tie into the kind of sale aspect to it? The question of whether or not Google, if it's collecting that data, could hand off information to the federal government. So walk me through sort of that. You've restricted the amount of data and type of data that folks could collect. Then what can you do with it?
Great question. So the legislation actually only regulates what we are calling precise geolocation data. So that's information that shows your physical location through your phone to an exactitude of within 1,850 feet. So it's less than a mile, less than half a mile radius. So that doesn't mean that, companies can't collect any location data. For example, companies could still collect information showing that I live in Boston and sometimes I go to New Hampshire, right? Presumably to go skiing because I'm going to the White Mountains or something like that. So companies could still collect that level of course location data and use it for all sorts of advertising purposes. What we're really trying to limit is data that tracks me not just to the address that I go to go to work or my home address, but the room that I'm in a given building. I mean, really, really very specifically accurate location data. So to answer your question, how do we regulate in these bills precise geolocation data? Google would still be allowed to collect, because it's strictly necessary to provide me with the address or the route that I've requested, the shortest route to get to, BU or something like that from my house. It would be able to track me the whole way, right? Because I want turn by turn directions. There's no problem with that. They can collect that data. It's strictly necessary for the service that I've requested. What they cannot do is then turn around and sell my precise geolocation data on the open market to anybody who wants to buy it. So that's really what we're trying to limit. We're trying to limit the collection of data to what's necessary. And then we're trying to limit the processing and the sale of that data so that, consumer expectations are met. Folks, I think, would feel totally comfortable with Google using their location data to help improve Google Maps. That's totally fine under the legislation. What's not fine is betraying the consumer's trust by then, opening up a side door and exchanging the data for some cash.
Gotcha. And one area where I've seen this kind of get a little bit messy, and it's actually come up in front of the state Supreme Judicial Court on this, is, well, what do you do with sort of anonymized data that is sort of filtered through ad tech, essentially? So this idea that you've got kind of these massive reams of personal data that are supposed to not be tethered to any individual person, but are used to sort of improve the functionality and the processing of these sort of broader systems here. Does this legislation treat kind of reams of anonymized data differently, or is that kind of saying, well, there can't be any broader anonymized data without this sort of hyper-specific data collection to begin with?
Well, this is a very fact-specific question, but generally speaking, it is very unlikely that the ad tech industry is using a lot of anonymous data. I mean, the whole point of it is that they want to be able to target us as individuals, right? So, take, for example, location data. For a while, they don't really say this anymore because it was so absurd on its face, but for a while, some of these companies were saying, no, this is anonymous. All of this location data is anonymous. Don't worry. We don't have your name attached to, your pieces of location data. Well, turns out that some of these companies were actually offering that service on the side, a re-identification service. But even if they don't, it is a trivial matter from a data science perspective to connect a user ID that's a consistent tracking number attached to someone's location data. It's not their cell phone number. It's not their name. It's just a user ID. It's trivial to connect that to a real person for a very simple reason. The vast majority of us are at home from the hours of midnight to 6 a.m. And the vast majority of us go to work somewhere on a sort of regular schedule throughout the week. And if you know even one of those data points, but if you know two of them, it is so simple to put names to those ID numbers. So, there's no point in the ad industry tracking all of us in all of these really detailed ways if they can't serve specific people, specific advertisements. So, the idea that it's anonymized is really fiction. It's not true.
And I think the last thing that I want to hit here is just, we went in and now let's come back out, which is you mentioned, of course, that it's not just state legislation that y'all are pushing for. It's also kind of working on the federal level. So can you explain right now what the current status of data privacy law looks like on kind of a federal level and what tweaks or massive changes you're pushing for there?
Yeah, we don't have it. We don't have any federal privacy law when it comes to 21st century consumer privacy issues. There was some movement in the prior legislative session in Congress, or maybe it was 2 sessions ago, actually, where when Democrats held the House and the Senate, there was movement on legislation called the American, I forget actually the acronym, but it was legislation that actually would have done some similar things to what we're trying to accomplish here in Massachusetts. And it fell apart at the very last minute due to concerns related to preemption. Basically, companies, their number one goal, the industry's number one goal in Congress was to say, all right, we'll agree to a privacy law, but you guys have to prevent the states from ever acting in this space because we don't want to have to deal with that. We don't want to have to send our lobbyists to state legislatures ever again. So just shut them out of the conversation and we'll come to the table. And that was reflected in legislation that made it really far. Ultimately, Nancy Pelosi put the kibosh on the whole process because California, as we all know, is the state that has done a tremendous amount of innovation in the privacy law space. California has a digital privacy law that they passed a number of years ago. They're frequently, passing legislation to ensure that the law keeps pace with technology and people's digital rights. And state lawmakers in California basically flipped out and said, how dare you? You better not let this bill go forward and deny us the ability to continue to innovate in this space. So it fell apart due to preemption disagreements, essentially. But, I think we can all see what's happening in Washington today. That's why we're really heartened to see that the Senate has taken action on this. The House is now hard at work on their own version of consumer privacy legislation. And we are very hopeful that we're going to be able to get this across the finish line this session. Nobody in DC is coming to rescue us.
Okay, well, I think we have to leave it there. But Kade, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
Thanks again to Kade for joining me on the Codcast. Thank you for listening. I'm Jennifer Smith. Our production and theme music is by Charlie Cazella. Leave a rating and review wherever you're hearing this now if you want to help other folks find us, and email Codcast at CommonWealth Beacon if you ever want to get in touch directly. We'll be back next week.